Well, I'm going to give probably the last mention of StrathE2E at this meeting, but just want to say thanks to the team that's been involved in this, and especially our early career researchers, who Jack mentioned this morning. This couldn't have happened without you guys, so thank you so much. And we saw the evidence of the fantastic job they've done in 4 talks and a poster at this meeting. So I want to try and sort of draw some of the strands together in this presentation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the model itself. I just got one mention about that. And then I'm going to quickly go through a couple of new concepts that Jack threw at you this morning about ecosystem, mean trophic level, and human appropriated net primary production. I explain what they are, why they matter, and why we're focusing on those. I'm going to go into some results. I'm not going to show anything for individual case study regions. I'm going to pull all 8 case study regions together and try and draw some sort of overarching ideas out of all that. Visualize how societal preferences for levels of pressures and ecosystem state might work, and then sum it up and add just a little bit at the end about ideas for how we might take all this forward in the future. So, StrathE2E was involved in both Seawise that Anna talked about this morning and Mission Atlantic. Now, the modelling in Seawise was all species focused, and mostly the models didn't represent trophic dynamics at all. So the connection between species in Seawise models, they were caught simultaneously in the same fishing gears. On the other hand, Mission Atlantic is really focusing on whole systems, and that's much more consistent with the philosophy behind StrathE2E, which is a whole system model. And in order to do that, we sacrifice species resolution in our models to represent the full end-to-end trophic dynamics. But that leaves these sort of nagging questions for Seawise about how wrong did they get it as a result of not representing trophic dynamics? And for us, in this project, how wrong do we get it as a result of our aggregation of species into core skills? For example, can we model primary production if we only have one bulk group of phytoplankton as opposed to 6 functional classes of phytoplankton? So I think throughout all of this, self-doubt is a really essential attribute. No models get it right. We all get it wrong to some point, but that's fine in these closed rooms, but perhaps we don't always say that in public. So moving quickly on, 2 indicators that Jack brought up this morning is this ecosystem trophic level, mean TL, and the human appropriated net primary production, HAN PP. So what are they? What do they mean? Why are we using them? So a little bit of equations, sorry guys. So the trophic levels of gills and the whole ecosystem. Well, the gill trophic level is a simple concept in a linear food web, because the trophic level of a consumer is just integer 1 more than the trophic level of its prey. That's just really easy. In a food web, it's not so straightforward because the consumers have got diverse diets, they're feeding at multiple trophic levels, they're convoluted pathways through the food web, so it's just not that straightforward. So instead of that, the trophic level of a consumer is not an integer, it's a continuous variable, and it's 1 plus the weighted average of the trophic levels of all its food. And there's the equation. So luckily there's a nice R package called net indices that calculates all that from our StrathE2E model output. All we need to do is to save all the results in what we call a flow matrix, which is the flows between every pair of nodes in the network of our model. And then we feed that into net indices and get an answer. So that's super easy. Ecosystem mean trophic level. So we're proposing that as a holistic indicator of the state of the whole system. And it's the biomass weighted average of the trophic levels of all the living components of the food web. And there's the equation. So you can easily see that as gills are lost from the top of the end of the food web, from the highest trophic levels, the mean trophic level of the system is going to be pushed downwards. And that's an important thing that we want to capture as a response to pressures that are applied to the ecosystem. But there are also structural differences between ecosystems, and they matter too. So what we've found as a result of having 8 models is that the systems with habitats that support macrophyte forests, in other words, rocky, shallow environments, have a lower trophic levels than those that don't. And macrophytes have a very low turnover rate, so they have a lot of biomass but low production in the system. But because they have very, very high biomass, they can influence the mean trophic level of the system very strongly. So, for example, in the Norwegian sea model that we have, macrophytes represent over 90% of the living biomass in that model system. It's huge, but the production of them is very low. So we're presenting mean trophic level as a rough measure of the whole system biodiversity. Moving on, net primary production footprint of consumers is an important part of how food chains work. So at each trophic interaction, only a fraction of the food eaten is converted into the consumer net production. That's called the trophic efficiency. It's typically about 0.1. So only 10% of the food that you eat gets turned into your production. So 1 unit of primary production, trophic level 1, supports TE, or 0.1 units of production at the next trophic level, and 0.1 squared of production at the next trophic level up, and so on. So conversely, primary production required to generate a unit of net production at a trophic level I increases geometrically with trophic level. And this is a picture of what happens if you do that calculation. So starting at a footprint of 1 for primary producers, by the time you get to footprint 5, you need 10,000 times the primary production to produce to produce a kilogram of whales, you need 10,000 kilograms of primary production to support it. And that's why whale biomass is so tiny compared to primary producers in an ecosystem. It's a really fundamental property of how ecosystems work. So you can think of that as a primary production footprint of a consumer. It's like an ecological price for a unit of secondary production. So that simple equation is dead easy in a linear food chain where transfer efficiency is constant. But in real world, trophic efficiency is not constant across trophic levels. And anyway, we've got these convoluted pathways through the network of who eats whom in the food web. In that case, calculating this footprint is not straightforward at all. But we developed an algorithm that crawls through the annual flow matrix, and starting at the primary producers, and calculates for each consumer what the primary product footprint is. Human appropriated net primary production, that's the fraction of the biomass that's extracted, and asking what's the primary production that was required to generate those landings. So the problem is that fishery landings comprise many species. The total weight landed doesn't provide a useful measure of anything very much of value ecologically. Monetary value is another way of thinking about it, using different prices for each species, but that's got only ecological significance. But this value of the footprint, primary production footprint of each guild, is really useful, because from that we can calculate the primary production footprint of the landings, and that's what we call this human appropriated net primary production. So it's a proxy in the planetary boundaries framework for biosphere integrity. And by proposing safe limits for the ratio of human appropriated net primary production to primary production, the plan is to identify terrestrial and marine areas where humanity is pushing the biosphere beyond its limits to support biodiversity. So we think this is a useful metric to pull out of our models. So moving on. So this is the story of net primary production in the StrathE2E models across the whole project. So net primary production is the difference between assimilation and metabolism. So it's the energy that's left to be transferred up the food web to higher trophic levels. And it's a zero-sum game. Ultimately, it's driven by nitrate fluxes into the system. You just can't get more out of it than you're putting in. It's difficult to measure on a large scale, on an annual cycle. Satellite spectral reflectance data is given as measures primary phytopigments, and they're often used to calculate net primary production, but with lots of horrible assumptions. But all in all, across the whole piece, StrathE2E does a reasonable job of capturing the scale of measured net primary production given its all uncertainties. So we've got some very, very high productive systems like the Benguela, and the model gets that, and we've got some very low productive systems like the Azores, sorry Leonor, and when we capture that too. So the future climate projections are mostly expected in our model to produce decreases in net primary production, as a result of bottom-up effects of temperature and nutrient fluxes. And here the black dots represent 2010's climate with current fishing. That's the real world. And the red dots are 2060's climate with 2010's fishing. And the blue circles are 2010's climate with no fishing. So the red dots in general are displaced down, The blue dots are about where they started. There is, in fact, a small top-down effect of fishing on primary production in our models, a trophic cascading effect. That's why we have trophic dynamics, but it's very small. So how does that relate? How does the human-appropriated net production relate to actual primary production? And the answer is not very clearly. So in this graph, x-axis is net primary production, and the y-axis is the human-appropriated part, what's caught. And it's not a nice, clear relationship. It's not straightforward, shouldn't be surprising, because that relationship will depend on the intensity of fishing and the selectivity patterns of different fishing gears for the model gills. So there's many ways you can extract the primary production footprint of the system, because by different combinations of fishing, you can catch different combinations of gills. And in the 2050s, both Han PP, I'll call it that now, and NPP have shifted to lower values compared to the 2010s in almost all regions with constant fishing activity. The exception is Benguela, where one of the ESMs produce an increase in primary production and the other produces a decrease. So that's all fine. So now I've overlaid onto that isopleths of the ratio of Han PP to primary production. So along each of those dashed curves, the ratio of Han PP to primary production is constant. And they go from 10 to the minus 4 at the bottom there up to 0.1 at the top. So a line orthogonal to those contours, the dashed contours, represents a gradient of increasing ecological pressure from fishing. And it shows that Senegal is under the most intense pressure from fishing with a ratio of 0.09, and the oceanic islands are under the least pressure with a ratio of 10 to the minus 4. So I think that's the first attempt at an objective, quantitative ranking of these systems with respect to this integrated fishing pressure. And I think that feels like a win. So how's that all working? And what's the safe limit for this ratio? Well, there's some consensus in the planetary boundaries literature, which is mostly driven by terrestrial thinking. It's about 8%. And that's pretty consistent, actually, with the results that we find from marine systems. In our model, decreasing net primary production as a result of climate change drives down Han PP max. And here is a yield curve, a bit like what Tanguy showed you this morning, but not expressed in terms of weight landed, but in terms of Han PP. So we can think of a maximum sustainable Han PP equivalent to MSY. And what's happened in this data set is that climate change into the future has pushed this curve down to the red one underneath. And if you like, the black cross in this little schematic corresponds to the black dots in my graph, and the red cross corresponds to the red points in my graph. That's what's, because fishing is constant in the graph on the left, and that corresponds to this blue vertical line here with constant fishing effort. So if we think about that another way, so these are pictures from the Senegal model for the 2010s, and let's look at it on the poster. So then the little schematic that I just showed in the previous slide is like one of many possible slices through the left-hand panel here. So the red dashed lines with an arrow on the end, there is a slice through that landscape, and the surface shows a dome-shaped response. And that schematic was like one of those transects through that space. There are other pressures low, like the seabed swept area ratio, the proportion of the seabed that's swept by trawling gears. And in Senegal, it's only the industrial gears that do that, the small-scale gears don't, so that's another dimension of pressure. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the response or the state of the ecosystem as a result of those combinations of fishing effort. And you can see it's nice monotonic decrease from the highest point when there's no fishing to the lowest when there's lots of fishing. I bring you all that together into this diagram, and Jack showed you sort of the beginnings of that idea in his talk. So the upper panel here, the x-axis is now ecosystem state, this mean trophic level index, and the y-axis is our ratio of Han PP to NPP. We must think of a better name for that, but anyway, arising from fishing. And the points represent many different scenario combinations of activity by the 12 fishing gears in the system. And the points are coded by seabed swept area. And the large black dot in the center represents the actual combination of fishing gears and reality. The upper envelope represents the ecosystem frontier beyond which no combinations can pass. But we're not exploiting the system to its maximum hand PP. That's the important thing, and why would that be? Because we've got preferences for other dimensions of the ecosystem which are not just about generating yield from it. So in the lower panel, the polygon enclosed by the frontier has been banded according to swept area ratio by these different colors. So the red patch in the lower panel represents areas where, in order to achieve that hand PP yield, you've got to have a lot of seabed swept area, and that's perceived to be a bad thing. So the societal preferences for hand PP to NPP versus swept area ratio versus mean trophic level are defined by what we call indifference curves, the black dashed lines. So those are isopleths where society has the same preference for the combination of conditions that we find in the ocean. And where those preference or indifference curves intersect with the ecosystem frontier defines the combination of gear activities which maximize the societal yields or societal benefits from the system. So that's a sort of emerging germ of the idea behind where we sort of want to try and crystallize this morass of model output. Huge amounts of time and computer from Yuri and all sorts of people boils down to like 2 or 3 numbers, which we can stitch together into sort of diagrams like this so you can try to explain to, well, all sorts of people actually. So to try and sum it up, we've got this amazing resource with a set of models that's really rare to have. There's a set of contrasting regions all modeled with the same model architecture so that we can actually do these genuine comparisons between regions based on the model performances. And that was sort of the dream we had at the start of the project. It feels so wonderful to have got there. So we've managed, I think, to objectively rank our model regions in terms of fishing pressure. I believe that's a first, and it feels good. Now the challenge is to define the safe limits defined by these additional dimensions of pressure and ecosystem state that we've come up with. And I think there are endless possibilities to explore what we can now do with this resource that we have. So all the models are going to be installed on the web app, so you can use them online without doing any R coding after some final polishing. The parameter files are going to be put up on the website as well as a resource, so you can download them and use them in the R package. Please play with them. It's great fun. And lots and lots of people had to go on the web app yesterday, and they all had a great time with it, so that's nice too. And there's a special issue of the ICES Journal of Marine Science set up. We'll have 12, 13, something like papers, and those are starting to be submitted. So, some thoughts where next, just to finish up. So we've done a lot of stuff, but there's lots of new questions coming in. Like, what about wind farms? What about noise? What about litter? And I think there are ways that you can treat the parameters of the model, the parameters of the uptake function between prey concentration and predator consumption in the model, treat them as levers that you can adjust to caricature the effects of these pressures on the ecology, such as litter and noise and aggregation of taxa around structures, which disturb the way that in a box model that predators perceive their prey concentration. I'm really interested in coupling this StrathE2E thing with models of human behavior and new classical economics. And on the right is a picture of how I've started to do that already. So inside the pale blue dotted box is a StrathE2E package. And then that's dynamically coupled to a model of how fishing métiers respond to the presence of structures in the sea and are displaced to move into different areas and try to optimize then economic profitability. Shipping is mentioned a lot. We had a lot of conversations about shipping in the Azores, and as a result of conversations with Mary about that, Jack and I now have a new PhD student who's working on trying to build a shipping model analogous to the existing fishing fleet model in StrathE2E, and that's going to be 3 or 4 years down the line after I've retired probably. But anyways, that's just how it goes. there's a picture of all of us. We had a writing retreat in Scotland. These are all people who are working on StrathE2E implementations. But I think we've got a massive cleanup of the model code to do, smoothing out its functionality, professionalizing the documentation, integrating new capabilities into the R package related to sensitivity analysis and fitting methodologies, and lots more. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Mike, for this summary of all the amazing outcomes that came out of this activity. So much appreciated. Any comments, questions? Dave?
Dave, I thought they would.
Of course.
It's a compulsion, Mike. I apologise.
It's all right.
So it seems almost churlish to criticise this brilliant thing. I'm quite concerned about the use of landings. So you link landings to the primary productivity that creates those. And the landings are A, a subset of all the species that are actually killed by the fishing, and B, an underestimate of the commercial species that are killed by fishing. And I've seen reports that the discard amounts can be an order of magnitude greater than the fish landing. That depends where you are. If you're in the Far East or Africa, there's no such thing as discard. So if you're in Europe or North America, they exist. Have you accounted for that?
Yes. So in the model, discarded material goes back into the food web. So it's available for scavengers to consume, and it degrades, and it becomes smaller detritus for detritivores to eat, and it becomes nitrate and ammonia, or ammonia and nitrate in that order, and is fed back in this completely enclosed biogeochemical food web that we have in this model. Right. So the landings are a flux out of this system. They're a boundary flux out of the system. And that's why landings are important, because they take energy and they take the footprint of the primary production that was required to produce them out of the system. That's what we're interested in.
Okay, really great answer, because that's the sort of basis of things like Fogarty and other industries. Yeah. And I really think that's the sort of holistic indicators that we do need to describe the whole system. So one criticism and you just field it with a bat. That's great.
Super. I may have a short, maybe more like a comment. What I feel is very useful, what you showed, is how we can distill this highly complex information, highly complex work into a couple of very easy overall ecosystem indicators, because that is really needed. When thinking about, probably you heard of the essential biodiversity variables, which are akin to the essential ocean variables. And among those 6 classes of EBVs, there are the ecosystem level indicators that we're supposed to come up with. And it's not something we can go out and measure directly. We need models to inform us about these kind of ecosystem level indicators. And I think what you've shown here is a good first attempt to narrow down all this complexity into a set of indicators, and even suggesting some reference levels for these fitting. So I think it's I think this is important to take bring out to the more general public and say, like, yes, we have a means by which we can calculate these ecosystem indicators that feed onto these overall classes of indicators, EBVs and EUVs. I think that message should come across. And also, of course, I can imagine that most of these indicators are in generic, such that they can also be estimated on the basis of most other ecosystem models around, because they don't really, they're not that biased by the underlying structure. So I think that could be an interesting next development. You compare across the set of StrathE2E models. Can we compare across other set of models that we have?
But I think you're always right by self-doubt about these indicators. It always feels as if they're not quite enough, you know. But I think the advantage of this human appropriated net primary production is that you compare it across terrestrial systems as well as marine systems, and there are people interested in doing that. I think that's a strength of it. You know, for all its faults, and Dave referred to some of them, then I think that's one of the advantages.
Yeah, and also that you can have some more network-based. So. Great achievements. I think we need to break there and invite the next speaker.